provided in the chat box. You can please feel free to pass this link on to whoever is not able to join via Zoom. Yeah, so Bengaluru Collective is a public forum of concerned citizens from in and around Bengaluru, committed to upholding our constitutional rights as citizens of a democratic, pluralistic, and inclusive society. In the recent past, we have conducted discussions with prominent public figures, academicians, civil society organizations, farmer groups, and labor unions. Some of our previous talks include public discussions on the farm laws, the citizenship amendment laws, labor law reforms, socio-economic census, and the role of the election commission. These talks can be accessed on our YouTube channel and Facebook page. The links will be provided in the chat box. Kindly note that we'll be recording and live streaming this event. Yeah, continuing. Bengaluru Collective is a volunteer-driven organization, a group, and we would like to encourage you all to take part in organizing the events. Interested attendees can reach out to us after the event to discuss for future activities. Today's session will be chaired and moderated by V. Sridhar. Sridhar is a senior journalist who specializes in economic journalism and is also a member of the People's Commission on Public Sector and Public Services. He was a former associate editor of the Frontline magazine of the Hindu Group. I now invite V. Sridhar to initiate the proceedings.
Thank you, Sai. Good evening and welcome to this discussion on the Union Budget for 2024-25. The expectations from this year's budget were shaped by two sets of factors. The first was set by the state of the economy, especially the kind of growth that India had witnessed since the demonetization of 2016, followed by the disastrous implementation of the GST the following year, and then the COVID-19 pandemic, all of which had resulted in widening inequalities, what some economists refer to as a K-shaped recovery of sorts. While incomes of those at the bottom of the social scale have remained stagnant or even fallen in real terms, and we're talking about both urban and rural areas, sections of big industry and those among the highest income groups have benefited greatly during this period. One of the striking features of the Modi government's response to the pandemic, standing alone among the nations of the world, was its steadfast refusal to use the tools of fiscal policy to provide an impetus to the economy while protecting those worst affected by the crisis. It refused to use fiscal policy to protect, and it refused to use it to invest in economic activity on its own or through its public sector enterprises. Meanwhile, consumption faltered, and despite much pleading, cajoling, and even outright begging by the leading lights of the Modi regime, private investment has not been forthcoming. The second set of issues germane to this discussion arises from the fact that unemployment, inequality, and the Modi government's general failure to protect the worst hit figured as central issues in the recent elections. There was some hope that the limited mandate may force the new government to correct course. Since the union budget is a prime instrument of fiscal policy, there was naturally an expectation that this is where the government would have to begin if it chose a course correction. This is what provoked the collective to caption the title for this talk as a question: Budget 2024, more of the same? Today's speaker, Professor Surajit Majumdar, is a well-regarded teacher economist who has specialized on aspects of India's political economy, particularly on Indian industrialization and the role of the Indian private corporate sector. He has taught economics at Delhi University, then as a researcher at an institution that specializes in industrial economics, before joining the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University a decade ago. Professor Majumdar has spoken earlier on our platform on the budget, and it is a pleasure to welcome him again. He will speak for about 40 minutes, which will leave about 20 minutes for a Q&A session. Over to you, Professor Majumdar.
Thank you, Sridhar, and thank you to the Bengaluru Collective for the invitation to share some thoughts on the theme of today's discussion, and specifically the budget, which was presented recently in Parliament by the Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman. Okay. I have a screen to share, so let me share it first. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, let me change the thing too. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Yeah, okay.
Good to go.
No, just
Sir, you can try view full screen mode, the first option.
no, I was trying presentation mode, which is what worked last time. I don't know why there's a problem this time. When we were checking, it was okay. Let me try full screen mode. Can you see the full slide?
Yes, sir, we can see the full slide.
Okay, then it's fine. I'll just manage with this. Okay, so one important element of continuity between the situation before the elections and after was that the finance minister itself was the same. But nevertheless, because of the what we saw during the elections and because of a perception that the election results, which went against what most of the opinion and exit polls had been predicting, and there was a reduction in the majority of the government, did reflect an underlying economic reality. And therefore, one expected that after the budget, there would be some kind of a response to those results to be which would be expressed in the what happens in the budget. But if one looks at the interim budget which was presented in February of this year, and the final budget presented in July, the interim budget was what we call a vote on account. So according to the constitutional provision, the financial proposals have to be approved by the legislature, which in this case is the Parliament of India, which has items which are voted upon and items which are not voted upon. And where the full procedure of approval of the legislature is not possible, there is a procedure laid down for the passing of a vote on account so that the normal routine expenditure of the government can continue. So the interim budget of 24-25 presented in February was basically this vote on account. So the vote on account should normally be one in which there is no significant new proposal being talked about, whether on the tax side or the expenditure side. But essentially, the numbers in the interim budget should be routine increases in different heads that were already part of the previous year's expenditure and revenue programs. So since there's no new tax proposal, since there's no significant new expenditure proposal, you just adjust the old figures to capture the fact that the economy has grown, there's some increase in GDP and things like that. So the interim budget is therefore a routine kind of exercise. And the final budget would be the one in which you expect the government to make significant proposals, whether on the tax or the expenditure side. But if one compares the numbers in the interim and final budget estimates, there are some slight differences which are on account of the fact that the GDP estimates for 24-25 on which the budget numbers are based have been revised in the light of revisions in the GDP for 23-24, which have been announced by the National Statistical Organization in between. So, but once you take these into account, so these are figures of the different major heads of revenues and expenditures of the government, of the union government, as a proportion of GDP. So if you look at the left-hand side of this particular table, you find that, of course, as far as gross tax revenues are concerned from different central taxes, the expected position in 24-25 in the final budget is not significantly different from what it was in the interim budget. Minor changes that are a result of the fact that there have been some minor changes in the tax proposals. No significant proposals for mobilization of taxes have been made. Instead, the few minor little bit of tinkering around with the taxes that have been done are supposed to result in a revenue loss of about 7,000 crores in the net. So you gain some, you lose some. The net figure is about 7,000 crores. So no significant change is expected in the tax revenue situation from what was estimated in the interim budget. And the part that comes to the center also remains roughly the same. It's in non-tax revenue that you see a somewhat more significant increase of 0.45% of GDP, which is what is responsible for higher revenue receipts in the final budget by 0.43% of GDP. Now, this is mainly on account of the RBI having in between declared a significant surplus, which it is transferring to the government, which was not known at the time of the interim budget. The surplus that is being transferred by the RBI is considerably greater than in the previous year. How the RBI has managed that is a different story, because it's essentially the provisions for which part of the RBI's profits would be used, that theirs have been reduced significantly, and a larger surplus is being transferred to the government. So it's the RBI surplus which essentially makes for a difference on the revenue side of the budget between the interim and the final budget estimates, but that's also limited to 0.43% of the GDP. If you look at the expenditure side, there too you find that there's very little change on the expenditure side. If you look at its different components also, there isn't a particularly significant difference. So there is basically a difference. Basically, you have marginal increases in expenditures, of which the most significant is in the head transfers, other grants, loans, and transfers. Okay, but the bulk of the increase and most of the increase is under the head of revenue expenditures. Capital expenditure actually is identical in the interim and final budgets. So basically, that additional revenue partially is being used to reduce the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. Okay, so if you look at these two sets of figures, you might wonder, okay, did the election results actually make any kind of a difference? If the final budget, in which the government had the option and the opportunity of taking significant decisions, both on the revenue and the expenditure side, give you figures that are almost identical with the figures that you had from a routine exercise, which is just a matter of projecting the old figures forward by a year, then clearly it is indicating that there is a very strong element of continuity. And the election results don't seem to have produced any significant difference in the fiscal approach of the central government. Okay. In fact, you could say that as far as this budget is concerned, they did nothing. Okay. You could have just worked with the old interim budget. This whole budgetary exercise leading to the final budget, ultimately, after all the discussions, deliberations, and decisions, you end up with something that was already there beforehand. So there is very little change between the interim and the final budgets, which is clearly indicating a strong element of continuity and an absence of any kind of effect on the approach of the government of the election results from what happened in between the interim and the final budget. Okay. Coming now to the actual, if you look at the actual, now one difference between the interim budget and the final budget that you get is that by the time this final budget has come, you no longer have to estimate what would be the expenditures and the taxes of the previous financial year, because by July, by the end of May, you get the provisional actual figures for the previous financial year, which the Controller General of Accounts releases every year. So this year's, the final budget, therefore, also has, for some parts of it, figures for the provisional actual figures for 23-24. Now, if you look at the change that has taken place in comparison to that provisional actual, we are comparing what the government is projecting for the 24-25 financial year relative to what it was in 23-24. Okay, so it is estimating that GDP at current prices will increase by 10.5%. This is nominal increase in GDP. Corresponding to that, they have estimated that the gross tax revenues will increase by roughly similar proportion. The part of that, that which comes to the state, to the central government, net of the state's share in central taxes, will grow by about 11%. Non-tax revenue, of course, shows the big jump of almost 36% because of the RBI surplus. Okay. So the total revenue receipts to the center are expected to increase by little under 15%, but significantly greater than the GDP is expected to increase. So the government expects that the revenue receipts as a proportion of GDP are going to go up in 24-25. As against that, the expenditure proposals that have been made and the estimates that have been put forward as to how much the central government intends to spend in the coming year, they are expected to go up by less than the increase in GDP at current prices. So the revenue side of the government's budget is expected to, as a share of GDP, to increase. The expenditure side is expected to come down. The bulk of the major part of this decline will fall on the revenue expenditure part, while the capital expenditure is still expected to go up as a percentage of GDP. But I shall shortly discuss the story behind this capital expenditure part. Okay. So now this itself, this approach where you are focusing on reducing or curbing the growth of expenditure and keeping it below the growth of the revenue receipts, okay, which essentially is an objective of trying to reduce the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. Okay, this reflects an approach that the central government has had for ever since the COVID pandemic. So in this particular table on the top, you have indices of the levels of different, the revenues and expenditures of the central government, treating 2019-20 as the base, which is the pre-COVID year. Okay, so if you look at the row on GDP, so the provisional actual of GDP being 146.9 in 23-24 means that the GDP at current prices in 23-24 was 46.9% higher than in 2019-20. Okay. Now look at the second row, however, which is the revenues from central taxes. So in comparison to the GDP at current prices, the gross tax revenues of the central government from all central taxes in 23-24 was 72.4% higher than in 2019-20. 46.9% GDP, 72.4% gross tax revenues from central taxes. And the center's share in the tax revenues is also similarly almost 72% higher than it was in 2019-20. Okay. The revenue receipts, which is including of non-tax revenues, are 62% higher, less than for taxes, but higher than in the case of GDP. Okay. If you look at central expenditure, however, central expenditure is about 65% higher, okay, of which, but when you look at revenue expenditure is something that appears to have been significantly held back and is only 48% higher than in 2019-20. When you look at the same figures relative to the GDP, as a percentage of GDP, which is the bottom part of this table, what you see is that by 23-24, the picture is that the revenues from central taxes and the share of those revenues that come to the central government, both as a percentage of GDP, are higher than they were in 2019-20 before COVID. Okay. Central expenditure is also higher, but in that case, the increase is not that significant. Okay. But when you compare with 2020-21, which is the year of the COVID pandemic, then a real story emerges. And which is that 2020-21, okay, actually because of the increase in petrol excise duties on petrol, the central government did not actually lose on the revenue side. Okay, its revenue still increased compared to 2019-20. Okay, but central expenditures had to, of course, go up in that particular year because of the COVID pandemic. Now, that increase in expenditure, however, was not what one calls a fiscal stimulus. The reason being that significant parts of the economy were basically shut down for a major part of that year. Okay, so when the significant part of the economy is shut down, even if you increase expenditure or stimulate demand in the economy, production cannot respond because administratively you've shut down different activities. Initially in the lockdown, and several activities were slowly opened up. So economic activity was arrested during that particular year. Increase in expenditures, whatever happened in that year, were, as Sridhar explained at the beginning, were nothing particularly dramatic. But whatever it was basically supposed to be keeping things afloat in a time when normal, regular economic activity was disrupted for reasons that are different from reasons that exist when it's economic factors which are responsible for a disruption of economic activity. So it was a non-economic factor which brought about a certain disruption, and certain increases in expenditure were necessitated by those conditions. Okay, but if a fiscal stimulus was to be imparted to the economy after that particular disruption, okay, then you should have seen expenditures growth, maybe combined with tax concessions, but at least expenditure growth in the period that followed, once the economic activity was able to return to regular levels. It's then that the fiscal stimulus would be necessary. But at that point of time, what you see is the onset of a policy. You can see clearly here. So the expenditure as a percentage of GDP goes up to 17.7% in 2021. Since then, it has been only coming down. And in 24-25 is expected to go down further. Okay. On the revenue side, however, as a percentage of GDP, okay, the loss has not been that insignificant. Okay. Revenues situation in 23-24 relative to GDP was better than it was in before the COVID pandemic. Okay. So what you essentially have is a situation where when there was a significant disruption of the economy, that significant disruption temporarily, because of those specific conditions, like everywhere else, had an effect of enlarging the fiscal deficit. And almost immediately, there was a switch in the fiscal policy towards what is called fiscal consolidation, where you basically try and compress the revenue side of the government's account in order to bring the fiscal deficit down. So the prioritizing of the reduction of the fiscal deficit was put into place almost at the same time as the lockdowns and other things were disrupting the economy in 2021. This is in sharp contrast to what happened in 2008. So in 2008, you had the global financial crisis. Okay, that global financial crisis had an impact on the Indian economy. In the first year, immediately after that crisis, India's GDP growth rate declined from the very high 8 to 9% levels it had been showing in the period before that. But it was still positive at about 6%. In 2021, it was more than minus 6%. So there was a contraction in 2021. So the COVID pandemic-related disruption of the economy was significantly greater than at the time of the 2008 global crisis. The 2008 global crisis was followed by a period in which a combination of tax concessions and somewhat stepping up of expenditure, again, a very limited, expenditure stimulus was put into place, which lasted till 2011. It's in 2010-11 that the move to fiscal consolidation and reducing the fiscal deficit, which had increased as a result of the stimulus, began. But here was an even bigger disruption of economic activity that took place in 2021. But even those 2-3 years of fiscal stimulus was not seen. There was no fiscal stimulus. Instead, impact on the fiscal deficit that was purely a result of the disruption of economic activity in 2021. Okay. Reduction of that fiscal deficit became the priority almost as soon as the deficit increased. And that's the policy that has been continued till 23-24. And what we see in 24-25 is a continuation of the same. So the interim budget and the final budget follow along the same track, where the attempt is to reduce the fiscal deficit by basically compressing the expenditure side of the union government's budget. Okay. Otherwise, if you look at it, the net revenue position of the revenue receipts of the union government in 24-25 is almost 1.2% of GDP greater than in 1920. On the expenditure side, you really have only a change of 1.4% of GDP. Okay. So what this is telling you is that by 23-24, the reason why the fiscal deficit was still, according to the government's conception, high, was not because revenues were hit by the COVID pandemic adversely. Okay. The reason why, in fact, by 23-24, it's quite clear that you cannot attribute the higher fiscal deficit to GDP ratio to the revenue impact of the COVID pandemic, because revenues have grown by 72% as compared to a 47% increase in GDP compared to the pre-COVID level. So the reason why you have a higher fiscal deficit to GDP ratio is because of what happened to the denominator in that ratio, which is the GDP. Okay, because that did not really increase that much. That's the reason why you're having a high fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. Okay, so that is indicating something about what's happening to the actual production activity, which I shall come to shortly. That's where the problem is. So that should hardly be a reason to think in terms of fiscal consolidation rather than imparting a stimulus to the economy. Okay. The other important feature that is highlighted in this table, one which is lot has been talked about in the last few years of the government, which is that the NDA government has managed to do something which was always talked about but never really achieved by previous governments, which was to shift the orientation of the expenditure of the government from revenue to capital expenditure, assumption being that revenue expenditure is non-productive expenditure and all capital expenditure is productive. Of course, revenue and capital expenditures are different in terms of their nature, but it's not necessarily true that all revenue expenditure is unproductive and that all capital expenditure is necessarily very productive in terms of generating higher levels of economic activity. And it's not even necessarily true that the stimulating impact on the economy of capital expenditure, of a rupee of capital expenditure, is always higher than a rupee of revenue expenditure. It depends a lot on what you're spending on under these respective heads. But in any case, there is a general perception that revenue expenditure is essentially like consumption expenditure. Once you spend it, it's gone. Whereas capital expenditure is expenditure which creates assets, which generates a future stream of returns in the economy, and therefore may have and therefore capital expenditure, even if financed by borrowing, can pay for itself, while revenue expenditure is something which future taxes have to be used to repay any borrowing that you may have done to finance your revenue expenditure. So the claim has been made that an important shift has been made in the direction of increasing the weight of capital expenditure of the union government. And that is, of course, something that you see continuing as far as the budgetary figures are concerned. So the sum total of the story is that the 24-25 budget, final budget, represents no break from the past in any sense. It's a continuation of that approach, okay? And it represents a very hard and extreme form of what is called fiscal conservatism. So 2003, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act was adopted, which kind of mandated that fiscal policy should be directed towards ensuring that fiscal deficit remains within a certain limit, whose main attack is on expenditure by the governments. Now that was passed by the Vajpayee government, notified by the UPA government after it got elected in 2004. It's been something that every finance minister, every government has agreed on. Fiscal consolidation was started by Pranab Mukherjee in 2011. So that's something that they have agreed on, but nevertheless, you see the severity of the fiscal compression in this period post-COVID being significantly greater than it was in the period after the 2008 global crisis. Now, if you look at the revenue side of the central government, okay, initially when the COVID pandemic took place, all revenues were hit, and the government compensated for that by basically raising the excise duties on petroleum and petroleum products. And that's how it tided over the initial couple of years. But subsequently, it is direct taxes, corporate tax and income tax particularly, which have been responsible for the significant rapid recovery of revenues. And government has been able to kind of roll back part of the increases in excise duties on thing. And therefore, the excise duty revenue position is today significantly below what it was in 2021 and 21-22. So the corporate tax and income tax revenues, direct tax revenues, and you can see as a percentage of GDP also, they experience a significant increase, and they are expected to contribute a major part of the increase in revenues even in the coming year. Okay. Now, when you get this kind of a figure, of course, it reveals something about what's happening in the economy. Now, clearly, corporate tax revenues and income taxes have not gone up because of significant increase in taxation rates. No major taxation proposal has been introduced here during this period, which would lead to an increase in revenues from these taxes. Essentially, what has happened is that the incomes underlying the income tax and corporate taxes, they have grown extremely rapidly, faster than the overall economy. And that is the reason why you have a higher rate of, you have an increase in these direct taxes during this period. Okay. So now those who pay these taxes, however, they constitute a very small fraction of the economy. So if you look at income taxes, while several crores, 6 crores, 37 lakhs income tax returns are filed by individuals, less than 500 million of them, which is 7.6% of the total, account for 84.2% of the total taxes. That because they are the ones with the high incomes. Okay, so it is a relatively small number of very high income individuals who account for the bulk of the income taxes. Similarly, when you look at companies, again, a very small number of companies, not even 1%, not even 0.1% of companies account for 58% of all the taxes that are paid as corporate taxes. So individuals, and so if you think of this, when we're talking about individuals, 6.3 crore individuals are only a small part of the population. They are, and their share in the households is also very small. Okay, within them also, if less than 8% account for the bulk of the tax liability, what that means is it is reflecting an extremely high concentration of the incomes, which form the basis for income tax. Similarly, very high concentration of the corporate business incomes, which form the base for corporate taxes. So when you see a trend of these revenues going up from these heads, it is not reflecting the story of what is happening to incomes in general or to corporate profits in general. It is reflecting what is happening to a small part of these two segments of the economy. Okay, so it's their incomes that have gone up. Now, in the case of corporate tax, it is entirely possible. And we've seen a trend of a rising proportion of companies making losses. And the losses of loss-making companies as a ratio of profits of profit-making companies increase. But if you make a loss, you don't pay a tax, you don't get a subsidy. But some make a profit, and therefore they pay more tax. So it is a small part of the economy where increases in income have resulted in this position as on the revenue side. Okay. Coming now to this whole thing about capital expenditure. Okay. So the point I'm trying to make is that the increase in the revenues of the government are not necessarily reflecting a healthy underlying economic situation. They are most likely to be reflecting a trend of rise in inequality and an even greater concentration of incomes right at the top of the ladder in the Indian economy. So the K-shaped recovery that was referred to in the introduction is what underlies this particular trend in taxes, okay, in tax revenues. On the expenditure side, when one looks at the capital expenditure, so if you look at the total capital expenditure, now in an economic sense, it doesn't matter whether it is government which spends out of its budget or public enterprises are investing. Both constitute public investment. So in national account statistics, when you look at public investment, you're looking at the total investment of general government as well as public enterprises. Okay, so not all public expenditure is done out of the budget. Partly is financed by resources of public enterprises. Okay. Now, if you look at that combined total, what you find is that there has actually been no trend in this period of an increase in capital expenditure. Significant push for greater capital expenditure. So the expenditure out of the resources of public enterprises have come down as the expenditure out of the budgetary resources, out of the budget has increased. And if you take the total figure as a percent of GDP, in no year since 2021 till 24-25, will the capital expenditure, combined capital expenditure by public enterprises and through the budget, exceed what it was in 1920 as a percentage of GDP. Okay. So the story of the expenditure pattern having shifted towards capital expenditure in part is a myth, because you're not accounting for what's happening to the investment through the resources of public enterprises. Investment through resources of public enterprises are, even in 24-25, going to be more than 42% lower than what they were in 2019-20. So even if expenditure through the budget has increased, okay, and if you say compare 2019-20 and 24-25, the budget estimates, you see a flip. In 1920, 1.7% of GDP was spent through the budget on capital expenditure. 3.2% of GDP was through resources of public enterprise. In 24-25, it's going to be 3.4 through the budget, 1.1%, which is through resources of public enterprise. It's a complete turnaround, flipping of the thing. But this is a redistribution of the heads through which where you spending public expenditure. It doesn't mean an increase in the total capital expenditure. Another interesting aspect of the capital expenditure comes when you look at the figures from where this increase is going to take place. Now, in this previous figure, please note that the budgetary estimates for 23-24 were higher, significantly higher than what was the actual. The revised estimates were lower and the provisional actual is even lower. So what was budgeted last year wasn't actually spent. Less than that was spent actually. Now, if you look at the capital expenditure for the coming year, okay, where has that increase taken place? And you find that there are two heads under which the most significant increases in capital expenditure are supposed to take place. One head, so it's not coming in central sector schemes or centrally sponsored schemes, nor in the establishment expenditure of the center. It is coming under these two broad heads, other central expenditure and other grants, loans, and transfers. Within them, in other central expenditure, there is an allocation to the Department of Economic Affairs of the Finance Ministry, okay, for new schemes. What schemes these are? Not announced. They were new schemes in the interim budget. They remain new schemes in the final budget. And the notes to those accounts say that these are provisions for future announcements. That means in July, you're already in the completed a few months of the new financial year. And you still don't know which are the schemes on which this allocation is to be spent. Okay. So that is like setting it up for not for underspending on capital expenditure even this year, because capital expenditure is an expenditure that is spread over a period of time. It has to be planned. Projects have to be worked out. It's not like you drop money today and tomorrow it gets spent. So it seems that the government doesn't even know where it wants to spend this. Okay, it's still thinking of the schemes under which this capital expenditure will take place. The other significant expenditure increase is in special assistance as loans to states for capital expenditure. So this is not directly central government capital expenditure, but loans it is giving to states for capital expenditure. And these two heads between them account for 2/3, more than 2/3 of the total increase in capital expenditure that is expected to take place in the financial year 24-25 as compared to the previous year. Okay. So just two heads are going to account for the bulk of the increase, which means that on the other heads, various heads of capital expenditure, various governments, and this doesn't include even railways and highways and all, which were important sectors in the past. Okay. None of them are being covered under this unless they decide that some of the new schemes will be for them. Okay. Now, if you look at the other second item, special assistance as loans to states. Okay. Now, this particular, increase in expenditure under this head actually happened first in 22-23. Okay. Because it was replacing. In 21-22, the government said it is not going to meet its commitments to states for GST compensation. In lieu of that GST compensation, it said it would borrow itself and provide loans to states. And in 21-22, you can see the figure that was there. Okay. And that year, the special assistance to states for capital expenditure was a relatively small item. Okay. Now, if you look at what happened, and then it stepped up the expenditure in 22-23 under special assistance to states for capital expenditure to compensate for the fact that those back-to-back loans in lieu of GST compensation were being ended. Okay. So actually the amount being given to states, okay, as forms of loans for financing their own expenditure for, or a capital expenditure, were brought down in 22-23. In 23-24, the allocation originally was less than what was the total amount transferred to states under these two heads in 21-22. In 23-24, the actual expenditure was less. And in the budgeted figures for 24-25, that combined total is still going to be less than the amount that was transferred to the states in 21-22. So this is indicating, what it is indicating is that the story of capital expenditure increases is in a large part window dressing rather than a reality. Okay. It is not actually resulting in any significant level of increase in public investment. Okay. Now, why is this then important? It has got to do with the fact that, as Sridhar earlier mentioned, if you look at what's happened to the Indian economy since the time of demonetization, before demonetization itself, you had certain trends in the economy. A slowing down of industrial growth, a decline in the proportion of GDP that is being invested, and private corporate investment itself was on the decline in terms of as a proportion of GDP. So you had a decline in the significance of trade, both exports and imports. Those trends were already in existence in 2016 when the demonetization took place. Okay. Part of that story was concealed by that impact of these things were concealed by the fact that in 2015, a new GDP series was introduced. But even the new GDP series was not able to conceal the fact that you had post-demonetization a significant shift taking place. So in the so whatever increase takes place in nominal GDP has two parts to it. One part is the increase in real GDP. The other part is that which is attributable to increases in the prices. Okay. So if you look at the part that is the real growth, that if you look up to 22-23, if you compare these 3-year periods, you can see a trend where the real real increase in GDP was declining, whereas the part that is on account of increases in prices was increasing. Okay. The only reason you get an 8.2% real GDP growth in 23-24, as per the latest estimates put out by the National Statistical Organization, is that somehow in 23-24, this has been reversed. So what you have is a 9.6% increase in nominal GDP in 23-24. Sridhar can bear me out. Those familiar with the history of the Indian economy, okay, would say that 9.6% increase in nominal GDP would normally be associated with very poor growth in the economy. But because you're getting, as per the national accounts calculations, only a 1.4% increase in price level in 23-24, your real growth is showing up as 8.2%. Now, the consumer price index, on the other hand, is showing you about a 6% rate of inflation. Okay. So any reasonable assessment would indicate that essentially, I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, but the methods that you use to calculate what is the real growth, there is some problem that arises from the fact that generally, while prices are increasing in the economy as captured by the consumer price index, the wholesale price index, which has a different sets of commodities influenced by a different set of things, that wholesale price index doesn't show a high inflation rate. And that's wholesale price index effect on your real calculations is what is showing up as an 8.2% real growth. And if that is the case, normally one would expect those who have a sense of integrity about these figures would have to examine that, is this a correct figure to put out? Okay. Technically, yes, the method may be generating this result, but is this a statistical illusion? Which it is. Because if you take 6% as the rate of inflation or a 9.6% increase in nominal GDP, this rate of growth, this percentage increase in real GDP comes down from 8.2% to 3.6%. Okay. Now, such a wide difference purely on the basis of choice of what price indices you're using to convert to real terms, okay, is what is responsible for this particular figure. This is not real, actually. This is not the real story. The actual rate of growth of the economy is much less. One also has to take into account the fact here that demonetization, GST, the COVID pandemic, all of these, by any reasonable assessment, have had a disproportionate impact on the unorganized sector. Okay. But there has been no exercise to actually measure what that impact was and how that should be factored into our GDP calculation, since we, of course, don't have figures every year for what is the unorganized sector is generating. If you look at the unorganized sector survey that has come this year, it shows an employment in unorganized enterprises which is at the same level as it was there in 11-12. Okay. So the GDP estimates, whatever problems were there in the 2015 GDP series, only get aggravated by the fact that you're not being able to capture what's happening in the unorganized sector. And on top of that is now this impact of WPI and CPI inflation rates varying on the real GDP calculations. So these figures of 8.2% simply cannot be accepted as a real figure of what's happening in the economy. The actual economic growth is much less. So what that means is you have a very strong contractionary situation in the economy, but within that, there is the burden of adjustment has been largely fallen on the majority of the population, other than those at the top who have managed to benefit from that adjustment by actually increasing their share in income, which is what we saw reflected in the revenue indicators. Okay. Now, we recently heard the Prime Minister talking about the increase in employment, and I don't know why he was referring to an RBI study. Is the government's primary labor force survey is the one which is supposedly indicating a significant increase in employment in the recent few years, reversing a trend of a decline in the employment to population ratio that was existing from 2004-05 to 2017-18. Okay. But if you look at that increase in employment that their own figures show, okay, it's bizarre. So almost more than 100 million jobs seem to have been added between 17-18 and 22-23, 56 million before, up to 2019-20, and 56 million after the COVID pandemic's effects. Okay. But if you look at the breakup of this, okay, bulk of it is in rural India. Almost the entire increase post-COVID is in rural India. Urban employment is less, according to those same statistics. And the entire increase both before and after COVID is largely, most of it is attributable to increase in self-employment. Okay. Regular employment and even casual employment has virtually not increased since the COVID pandemic in absolute numbers. Okay. So the higher proportion of employment to population that you get is largely on account of more women apparently coming into the work. But when you look at the actual, where the increase is supposed to have taken place, agriculture being a large sector of contributing a significant part of the increase in employment would hardly be considered as a very positive sign as far as the employment situation in the economy is concerned, given that we already have a large overpopulation in agriculture. Okay. And so this increase in self-employment is what we are seeing. And if you look at one set of figures, it also makes it clear how bizarre these figures are. Okay. So according to the PLFS, employment is increased by almost 25% between 17-18 and 22-23. In that same period, the capital stock of the economy has increased by more than 37%. But real GVA at basic prices, according to the same national account statistics, has increased by just 23%. What kind of an economic growth is this? Where the capital available per person employed is supposedly increasing, but the productivity of labor is declining. So if you take all the different figures that are being put out as signs of a healthy economy and put them together, this is the picture you get. Okay. So the only way the Indian economy got this increase in employment is by actually sacrificing productivity growth. Okay. And that tells you what that actual increase in employment is like. It's basically distress employment that is being captured in some form or the other. And that is what is being talked about as an increase in employment. And the impact of that you can see in the earnings from that employment. That in all types of employment, the increase in earnings over the same period in nominal earnings are less than the increase in the price level. And the worst performance is in self-employment, where there's a significant decline even in nominal earnings, okay, which is where you are getting the maximum increase in employment. So both on the output side as well as the employment side, you have clear signs that that statistically things are being shown, but the real state of the economy, that once you delve deeper into those same statistics, you find that there are signs of severe economic crisis. But because a certain segment of the population is benefiting from that crisis, you are getting a certain picture in terms of revenues. And that is in fact allowing, and this is my last slide, I'll conclude with this, allowing a certain kind of politics to play itself out. When people's incomes are not increasing, or even contracting. Okay. Small kinds of different kinds of state support can become important. And in the Indian politics, they've known from the time of Garibi Hatao how those small things can be significant in terms of the political returns to governments who initiate policies which give that kind of support. Now, what is actually happening is that because a certain segment of India is becoming richer than the rest, and the rest, the majority, is becoming, in a sense, relatively and perhaps even in now absolute terms poorer, what you're getting is a situation where the government is also, because of the revenues coming from the top, becoming richer relative to the rest of the population. Not as rich as the rich, but richer relative to the poorer parts of the population. Meaning that the revenues that are available per capita with the government, with which different kinds of schemes can be initiated, which form supports of different kind to people whose normal economic activity creates a situation of distress. The scope for that is increasing, and it is this kind of false politics of redistribution that seems to be the preferred approach to respond to the crisis that is there. And this false politics of redistribution, obviously the conviction is that this can still work, and therefore it is not necessary to change trajectory in terms of the fiscal policy approach. So you neither use fiscal policy to address the question of the fact that because large number of people in the economy don't have money to buy, that they have a severe demand constraint in the economy, nor do you use fiscal policy to do any kind of redistribution from the rich to the rest. Okay, so in a sense, fiscal policy is facilitating that increased inequality. I call that the great reset of the Indian economy, because that inequality increasing process was reaching certain limits before COVID. COVID has been used to make the large majority of India's working people adjust to lower incomes, and the benefit of that has gone to the top, and that is the gain that they have had, which has been facilitated by this fiscal policy, and is the continuation of that rather than addressing the systemic roots of the crisis the Indian economy is facing, that is reflected in the Union Budget 24-25. So with that, let me conclude, and I'll happy to take questions.
Thank you, Surojit. While we wait for questions, I have a couple.
Yeah.
One is this whole there were a slew of, promises, stretched over a time frame about employment, but it looks like these are more in the nature of subsidies to employers rather than actually incentivizing employment on some scale. One. The other thing is that you mentioned, towards the end of your talk, you spoke about the government's ability to raise resources of some kind provides it with a cushion of sorts to indulge in ad hocism, which allows it to address this extreme stress that a large section of the population is facing. What are the limits to those, and how soon, or how would they possibly unravel?
Well, actually, both your questions are related, in my view. And this relation comes from the fact that when it comes to the measures of encouraging employment, okay, why do you take these measures, which you broadly speaking can be called supply side measures, firstly, where you are subsidizing the employers, okay? So the emphasis there is ensuring that the cost to the employer of hiring people, okay, is not increased. Now, there is a fundamental issue that is there in that the Indian economy is facing on the employment side, which needs to be also kept in mind in this regard. And this is that for about 30 years, you've had a trend that because of the cheapening of capital goods, okay, globally capital goods prices have been cheapening as a result of increases in, technological improvements, etc. Capital goods have been cheapening, as have been most consumer goods. Okay. The use of software, etc., is also kind of played its part in that particular process. Now, what is happening is that because capital goods have been cheapening and cheapened drastically relative to food prices, okay, what you're getting is a situation where the price of, the cost of hiring worker, even when you keep their real wage constant, in a low wage economy like India, the bulk of the expenditure of wages is on food. Food is the principal wage good. So the real wage essentially tracks the prices of food. So if food prices go up, the nominal wage has to keep pace with that in order to keep real wages constant. While when it comes to capital goods, the capital goods prices are cheapening. So it's already created a very strong labor substituting tendency in the economy, even when you have constancy or stagnation in real wages. Now, Indian enterprises also, in terms of global competition, primarily rely on cheap labor as their basis for competitive strength. They don't have other kinds of abilities, technological capabilities to compete. So in a sense, the prosperity of the small segment in the corporate sector and individuals in the economy rests on a guaranteed continuous access to extremely cheap labor. Okay. That's the one thing that you do not want to change. Okay, so the prioritization of their interests means that ensuring that wages do not go up, the earnings from laboring activity do not go up, has a priority. So even if you want to encourage employment, you choose an approach which doesn't increase the cost of hiring workers for the employers. The same thing also puts limits to the extent to which these kind of what I call false politics of redistribution, these kind of methods can be actually used. Because if you raise the, of course, there are fiscal limits to constraints to that itself. But in addition is this fact that if the level of support that the state provides increases beyond a certain limit, then the availability of cheap labor, okay, is potentially threatened. Okay, why should anyone slog it out for barely surviving if they can survive with some kind of different kinds of combinations of state support? So that's puts a certain limit. So actually, if you look at the expenditures on these kind of schemes, there's a certain politics that has played itself out, but it's clear that wherever possible, the attempt is made to pull back and to keep that kind of support within a certain limit. Okay, and if your overall fiscal numbers are such that you're basically focusing on employment compression, all that they then do is announce one scheme here and say, I'm allocating more here, but they'll be cutting somewhere else because the overall size of the cake has to remain limited. So I think so the logic at work in all these cases is the ensuring that the availability of people to work at extremely low rates for the buyers of labor services of different kinds.
There are a couple of other questions. One is about there's a question from Deepak Johnson who asks whether shifting that you have sort of indexed for example, the corporation tax rate, does moving it back to say 2018 make any material difference according to you? That's one.
Yeah.
And secondly, There's another question from Sai Chandan Kotu, who asks whether does this budget signify a complete withdrawal of industrial policy as a strategy to drive the manufacturing sector? He asks this because the production-linked incentive scheme doesn't seem to have figured much at all in the FM's speech. So,
okay, so let me.
Yeah, we will go.
I think this is a good point that has been raised about the 2019. Yes, 2019-20 itself, corporate tax revenues did fall, partially on account of concessions that were announced in the middle of the year in the background of the slowdown that year.
Yeah, especially the automobile sector, if you recall.
Automobile?
Yeah, you will recall at that time there was a steep slowdown in the automobile sector, and the auto lobby went to town.
Yes. Okay. But if you're talking about automobiles themselves reflect the situation as to what has happened in the economy. So if you look at the sales of passenger cars, okay, they have more than recovered from the levels they had in 17, 18, 18, 19. Okay. So there was a drop, but the post-COVID recovery has seen passenger car sales exceed the levels that were there before the COVID pandemic, the last few years before the pandemic. And within the cars, we know, of course, the category of vehicles which are leading this growth in sales are the relatively more higher end vehicles than the cheaper ones, which made the bulk of the passenger car market in India. If you look, however, at the sales of motorcycles, which depend significantly on rural demand, you find that actually even in 23-24, the levels are lower than they were before the COVID pandemic. So the K-shape you can see even in the automobile industry. Yeah, but yes, coming to the point about, yes, in 1920, there was already a sign of a slowdown, and that slowdown had affected corporate revenues, and the additional impact of that was the concessions that were given in corporate taxes. Yes, that is true. But what I was talking about is that since then, so there was a trend of corporate taxes actually coming down because of the underlying economic trajectory. So let me put it this way, that before the COVID pandemic, you had a certain trend in the economy where output growth was tending to slow down. As far as output growth is concerned, the COVID pandemic's effect has been to aggravate that slowdown. Okay. And it is a statistical illusion that we have that we are one of the fastest growing economies of the world. So the growth process has been adversely affected. But while before the COVID pandemic, the growth process, the growth slowing down was also affecting severely the higher income groups and their ability to generate growth in incomes and profits, which was impacting the revenues, particularly from corporate taxes as a proportion of GDP coming down. Okay. That's the part that has got reversed after the COVID pandemic. So the COVID pandemic, in a sense, has not led to a change in the overall trajectory of the economy in terms of its growth. Okay. But how the benefits of that growth are distributed, it has reproduced or recreated a trend that previously was associated with phases when the Indian economy was growing very rapidly. So 2003 to 2008, India's economy grew very rapidly. But it was also a period in which inequalities increased tremendously. But it was basically that the top increased at a very fast rate, much faster than the rest of the population. And the rest of the population didn't, of course, participate in that growth to the same extent. But in this period, it's not been driven by growth, high growth of the top. It's been actually much more of a process of redistribution from the rest towards the top percent of the top sections of the population that we have seen in the period after 1920, after the COVID pandemic. So in a sense, the crisis created by the COVID pandemic has been taken advantage of, and the fiscal policy approach of the state has facilitated and enabled this to happen. as far as the industrial policy question is concerned, it's true. I mean, I don't think that India has had an industrial policy in the last 30 years, despite all the talk about it. As far as industry is concerned, I would say, firstly, keep in mind that from 2011-12, and it's not recent, from 2011-12 till the present, we have been facing a period of industrial stagnation, in which the growth performance, at least in terms of volume of industrial production, has been no better than what it was between the mid-60s and mid-70s, which have been described in India's economic history as the stagnation, industrial stagnation decade, on which a major debate has taken place in the past. So we are already in a period which is longer than the second decade of industrial stagnation. So the second decade of industrial stagnation is already over. That period itself is continuing. Okay. There has been no serious effort to address this particular problem about the industrial sector in India, though manufacturing sector, though various nominal announcements and all keep making it. The PLFI scheme, the production linked incentive scheme, also has shown, and that essentially there has been no process of revival or pickup of investment in manufacturing, because essentially manufacturing is the sector worst affected by the demand constraints in the economy. And the fact that the manufacturing sector is so affected also affects the investment process in the economy, because manufacturing is an important sector of investment. Many services, even if they grow, do not absorb significant amounts of capital. They do not involve significant amounts of investment. So manufacturing is very much central to this problem of demand and the problem with investment, which in turn is affecting demand in the economy. There has been no real effort to address this problem. The production linked scheme also was essentially what? That whatever little manufacturing activity is happening, you in a sense do some kind of subsidization of that to the benefit of the, but it doesn't necessarily induce significant levels of investment and creation of capacity in manufacturing. Okay. So it's not really worked in terms of the few years that it has been implemented. And therefore, perhaps that's the reason why the emphasis on that, though the few more activities have been added to the list, the emphasis on that is coming down because it's not really delivering any results. Okay. But this is the case with several things. So demonetization was supposed to address the problem of black money. Demonetization is something no one talks about today. Make in India was also about manufacturing. Okay. No one is talking about that today. Okay. So because you say one thing, the essential problem is that the approach, which is also reflected in the fiscal policy, is that you are simply not going to even acknowledge that there is a problem on the demand side. Okay. What you will do is to try and create or take measures which will induce private investors to invest and drive the growth and employment process of the economy. So essentially what happens is that in the name of promoting growth, you subsidize private capital. And when it doesn't deliver in terms of actually giving you investment, you make that as a pretext for further subsidization of private capital. How long will it take for, Nirmala Sitharaman in the middle of after the COVID pandemic once is reported to have asked the private corporate sector, why aren't you investing? And my question immediately that sprang to my mind was, why did it take you so long to ask this question? They haven't been doing it for more than a decade. Okay. So how long will it take for you to accept or realize that this is simply not working? You just keep doing the same thing in new forms, in new names. Okay. And now I think they're running out of ideas. That is why you have this head called new schemes, but no schemes being announced. If that was almost 40% of your increase in capital expenditure, why didn't you not make big announcements that, okay, you're going to do this now? Because they don't have any idea about what is really to be done, because these same methods have been tried and tried and tried, and they don't get you anywhere. So there is no such thing really as a industrial policy in India. I mean, firstly, most of the measures are ad hoc. Okay. And in terms of the measures themselves, there is a clear pattern that you simply refuse to address the problems on the demand side. And you think that giving benefits and incentives to private capital will deliver results. It has not, and it cannot, because no one is going to sink money if they don't think that there is a market in which they can sell the commodities. Yeah. So what private capital also thinks about the state of the economy, judge that not by what statements their various associations put out, but judge them by what their decisions about where they put their money is. So are they putting their money in industry and manufacturing on a significant scale? There's no evidence that is happening. Those who have a history of being engaged in manufacturing are also looking at other avenues to invest in now, rather than focusing on manufacturing.
There's a question from Chetan Yadav, who asks, what is the has the budget done anything to support small and medium enterprises? Is there something in it at all?
There's nothing. That's the simple answer. And small and medium enterprises have even much more, their activities depend on the larger demand conditions in the economy, because they are not in a position to fix the market conditions in the way that some big players can. So in fact, the demand constraint situation is facilitating a situation where most of the more and more of the economic activity is getting concentrated in the hands of relatively small number of big enterprises. And the same thing is also happening in manufacturing.
What do you have to say about these two partners of the NDA who hold them in power now, and the terms of those, what appears to be largesse of some kind? What do you make of it?
Yes, I am not quite convinced that there is that much largesse. And the reason I say that is that with regard to Andhra Pradesh, if you see in the numbers in the budget, there's no clear picture about where the allocation in terms of different states and all are. Okay. In the budget documents, you don't get that. What we have been hearing about is basically from the remarks made in the budget speech. So if you look at the remark with regard to Andhra Pradesh, the statement made by the finance minister says that the government, appreciating their requirement for a new capital, will facilitate the borrowing from international multilateral development agencies to finance that particular thing. And for the coming year, this support will be for 15,000 crore rupees worth of assistance, which means it is not a budgetary allocation of 15,000 crores. It is that they are going to facilitate borrowing from multilateral agencies for by the state of Andhra Pradesh. With regard to Bihar, several different projects were mentioned. And the figures mentioned are actually the figures about the project costs. Okay. Now, so project costs will be spread over several years. So it's not clear how much is going to be going in this particular year. And project costs, so there is a power plant, etc., and all of that, which could be financed by the resources of public enterprises rather than out of the budget itself. So it's not quite clear that significant allocation has actually been made to these states. Until we get greater details about what the allocations, where they're going, there might be some in this additional capital expenditure in the form of assistance to states, but these are also loans. So while there is entirely possible that some bias has been shown in favor of Bihar and Andhra in this particular budget, which we probably know in time, that bias will probably be still in terms of the extent to which they are given a bad deal. I think all states are getting a bad deal, including Bihar and Andhra Pradesh. Maybe their bad deals are a little less bad than that for other states. If there is any discrimination, it's of that kind, because the overall budget, if you're not spending, if you're you're reducing your expenditure to GDP ratio, if you're not increasing nominal expenditure by only 8.5%, which is almost a zero growth in real terms, there's no way that you can do anything significant for even Andhra or Bihar. But the figures that are there in the budget speech refer to either borrowings or project costs. One should not read them as meaning budgetary allocations of that amount.
There's a specific question about the allocations for the National Safai Karmacharis Finance Development Corporation. There's a question from Hari Prasad. What he asks is, I think he says, it's under the head total central sector schemes under the subheading public sector undertaking. There's only a very small allocation. But there is a capital investment of about 259.12 crores for the same institution, I mean, the same public sector enterprise. So is this for some technology upgradation which will reduce the drudgery of manual labor associated with scavenging? I mean, something like that? Or is there a laudable motive of some kind behind this? Or what is it?
Well, I must confess that I've not looked at this specifically, so the specifics I may not be able to comment on. But more broadly, I would say that I mean, it does reflect a certain kind of approach where revenue expenditure, all kinds of revenue expenditure, has been kind of run down as something that is, and it becomes a pretext for actually cutting expenditures where they are the most needed. Okay. So if you, for example, and often it can result in a situation where the expenditures can also be wasted. So for example, during the COVID pandemic, we saw a situation where in several states, UP and all, you had hospitals with beds, equipment, but no doctors and nurses too. Similarly, you can have colleges and schools, and you can have buildings, and you can have infrastructure. But ultimately, if you don't have teachers and staff, things don't get done. Now, so any meaningful expenditure has to involve both these components in proper ratio to each other. And if you don't do that, then even the capital expenditure that you make can be just a waste. So this running down of all kinds of revenue expenditure may be the reason why you're getting this kind of a hit, this kind of a thing. And so let's say, for example, I don't know the specific heads for which revenue or capital expenditures were made under this head. I can look it up and get back later. But let's say in several things, like if you have to give fellowships to or financial assistance to enable people to move away from certain kinds of things, or to get access to better kind of education and all of that will be revenue expenditure. And we say all revenue expenditure is bad, you cut that down. Any form of subsidy, you cut that down. So that kind of approach is there, and this squeeze on expenditure primarily through constraining revenue expenditure is showing up, will show up in different ways in different things of the economy. So even when a particular head gets a total, supposedly, apparently a total increase in expenditure, okay, what may be concealed within that is actually a cutting of expenditures. And perhaps that might be what is happening in this case also. So under capital expenditure, you put something, but that capital expenditure may not even happen because you don't have any of the complementary expenditures, or even if it happens, it doesn't really necessarily produce any result. But this extreme form of denigration of revenue expenditures and valorization of capital expenditures without any sense of the relationship with each other or the nature of these expenditures is something that is a feature of fiscal policy, particularly of this government. And we've seen the effects of that in various sets. And maybe something like that is showing up here also.
Okay, so I think we've reached the end of today's discussion. And thank you, Surajit, for providing us a very interesting analytical frame to look at this budget, especially because of the expectations that surrounded this, the context in which this budget was presented. The political context, the immediate election results that led us to this expectation. And it's an excellent, very interesting analytical frame to look at this in a short to medium term, especially in the context since the pandemic, what's happening to the Indian economy, and what is and situating the budget as a way of orienting this kind of a policy, which is very retrograde, and there are very serious consequences that people have to face because of this. Thank you so much for providing this interesting analytical thing so soon after the budget, and that's we're very grateful to you for this. Sai,
thank you for having me there.
Thank you. Sai, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sridhar. On behalf of Bengaluru Collective, I would like to thank all the participants for registering and participating in this online discussion. I thank Sridhar for chairing and moderating the session and for providing the context for today's topic of discussion. Finally, I thank Professor Surajit Majumdar for accepting our invitation to speak on this very important and topical issue. We have gained, as Sridhar was mentioning, we have gained useful insights and perspectives into analyzing the budgetary allocations, particularly in the context of India's growth trajectory and the economic distress that we are witnessing. I request everyone to follow us on our social media handles to receive updates on our future activities. Please reach out to us for any clarifications. The links for the social media handles are posted in the chat box, and the recording of this event will be made available on our YouTube channel. Yeah. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Surajit. Thank you so much.